and face. Some of you may know me. I have kind of a dual role in the community. I run the Mary Morton Parsons Foundation, and I also have a pretty active consulting business. And Mary Morton Parsons, you guys all know that we give out grants for capital projects, and we have two cycles a year. And we just went online with our grants. Or about a year and a half ago. So if you want to talk separately about Mary Morton Parsons, today's not the day morning's not the day to do that, but I'm happy to do it separately. But today I'm online as a consultant, and I've been doing consulting for about 15 years. I do not technically do grant writing. I have a colleague, Karen LaForge, who has a separate part of our business, who she does grant writing. I used to do grant writing, but I do teach this class in a couple places from the funder's perspective, because I obviously look at a lot of grants. But in my consulting, I do strategic planning, board development, executive search, lots of board retreats, kind of everything you would think of other than grant writing. And I do fundraising audits, development audits, and I also do help people write fund development plans. So anyway, so today we're going to talk about a funder's guide to successful grants. In the chat, there are several handouts. I'm going to go to the chat for 1 second because I do want to point out a couple things. So the one that says proposal organization, I took a national grant class when I worked for the Visual Arts Center many years ago, and I was the development person, and they gave out these worksheets that are kind of working documents that you can use for bits and pieces of a grant. So I really think that that's a great resource. It is their resource, but I've given it out and given them credit, so it's a really good resource. And then there's a resource about budgeting that comes from the CPA Association. There's some a funding slide on some sources. You guys probably know more up-to-date sources than I do, but anyway, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else. That might be the only three. But if I do mention something on the call today that you're not familiar with, stop me. I don't get freaked out by that. I would prefer to answer the question in the moment, because if you're asking the question, somebody else is thinking it also, I'm sure. And of course, if you have any other questions, I'm happy to help. So if you can introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. If you want to put your name or your organization on your slide, that would be helpful to me. But if not, don't worry about it. So we're going to get started, and I'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So let me see how to move this. Sorry. Oops, I just moved you guys. Where'd you go? Sorry, hold on. Okay. So Catherine.
Yes.
I can no longer see the people in the room. Can you fix that? I don't know how to fix it. Sorry.
I don't think.
Do you know what should I do? Escape?
Well, you need to share your screen. So
Oh, yes, you're right. Thank you. You didn't share it. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Forgot. That's right. Thank you.
And then that's going to minimize the amount of people that you could see.
Yep. Gotcha. Yeah, I do know how to do this, believe it or not. All right, here we go.
While we're waiting on that, Amy, you referenced some resources in the chat. I think that was posted perhaps before most people got on. Can we repost those?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Catherine.
And I'm going to close this a little bit. Let's see if I can close it. There we go. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, here we go. So let's get started. What happened? Okay, so the first slide is about when are you ready to write a grant? And I want to make sure that this is kept at the forefront, because again, I've written grants before. I've read a lot of grants, and I want to make sure that that the funder can tell when you're not organized, or when you've kind of put your thoughts down, at the last 5 minutes, or used a boilerplate. And so, that doesn't always bode well for long-term relationships. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but again, a lot of these are really, really critical. A couple of them I'll point out is that, if you have a strategic plan or some kind of business plan, make sure that you've tied your funding needs to your strategic plan and your, kind of referencing, what's a priority, what's not a priority. Make sure that you've thought through your plan, you've articulated your outcomes, and make sure that with your budget, most grantors require a program budget and a operating budget. So the operating budget is your full organizational budget. So, and it's very important to do your research. If I don't say that enough, it's really important. One of the things that, grantors can tell when you haven't done your research, because, sometimes if you ask for like a $50,000 grant and that's not really in the purview of that organization, they're going to be able to tell. Or like with Mary Morton Parsons, if you ask for anything under $25,000, I'm going to know that you probably didn't do your research, because we have a 5-year wait out and you kind of don't want to waste your 5 years on a under $25,000 request. Okay, so why isn't this moving? Sorry. Okay, so there's several kind of grants. I'm going to cover today more of the foundation, but there is corporate grants. I used to work for Wachovia, which is now Wells Fargo, and corporations typically give out money in 2 different ways. Some corporations have a foundation where it's similar to a private independent foundation, where money from the taxes, after tax profits go into this foundation, and then they distribute it. Usually, when I worked for the bank, they usually distribute it by community. So like I covered Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So we had a whole budget for the state, and it was allocated by percentage of business. So typically Richmond had one of the largest budgets. And with corporate foundations, you cannot get any kind of benefit to your organization. So it's really different than sponsorships. And so it's real important that you understand that most corporate foundations, when you go in and you have to take that quiz, or the eligibility quiz that some of them have, if you say that, they usually ask a question about, are any of our employees get any kind of benefit, or is there any kind of benefit with this? Then that automatically means it doesn't come out of the foundation. It comes out of their sponsorship or marketing program. There are also some foundations who don't have there are also some corporations who don't have a corporate foundation, and they give, it's called a direct corporate giving program, and they typically don't distinguish between foundation and sponsorship. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. Also with corporate foundations, usually there is typically a separate person in the organization called the community affairs person, who actually helps do the due diligence and with that. So, I know that you're probably familiar with some of them, Yvette Roots at Wells Fargo, and I know that Victor used to do it at Bank of America. I'm not sure who's doing it now. But anyway, and then at the banks, there's also some private foundations at banks. So, Wachovia has a couple of those. Wells Fargo has a couple of those. Bank of America has a couple of those. SunTrust has a couple of those, and they're usually run similar to a private foundation. And I'll go over private foundations next. So, but first, corporate foundations, again, they're pretty important. According to this organization called the Council on Foundations, there's about 3,000 corporate foundations in the United States, and they earn about $11 billion in revenue and have an estimated 95 billion in assets. So you want to make sure, that'll come out later, that assets are very important to know how much a foundation has in assets under management when you do your research, because that affects the amount of money they give out in their service area. And some of the examples of corporate foundations, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Target has a foundation that goes to local schools. Ronald McDonald House has a foundation that's usually supported by the franchises. I know that Altria does not have a corporate foundation. They have an employee foundation, employee fund that they give out money. So everybody works a little differently. So as far as private foundations, they're typically, hold on a second, I can't see. I'm gonna move this up. Technical difficulties. Typically, private foundations usually have a trustee group or a board of directors. They give out money for 501c3s. Typically, sometimes it's 501c9 supporting, and they only make grants to other nonprofit organizations. If you are in the process, if somebody's in the process of starting a foundation, typically they don't give you, private foundations don't give you money until you have your 501c3 designation. So just be aware of that. This is also pretty important statistic that in Virginia, there's about 2,900 private foundations. There's about $10 billion in assets under management, and most foundations have, $10 billion in assets, and most foundations have assets under $1 million. There's only a few people that have assets larger than $1 million. Mary Morton Parsons happens to be one of those. We have, on a good day, about $130 million in assets under management. And which means that most of our grants are fairly large and impactful. If a foundation has under $1 million in assets under management, their grant size is much smaller, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 or less, sometimes $5,000. So you want to make sure that you have looked at the assets under management. And if you're doing any kind of grant research, typically there is a list of foundations found in of organizations they've supported in their 990. And so you can usually look and see who and what the amounts they've supported. Does this thing keep doing that? So there are 4 different types of private foundations. So Mary Morton Parsons, just as an example, fits into the top one. Cabell Foundation fits into the top one. Usually some of the family foundations, Robbins Foundation fits into the top one, the Reynolds Foundation. So we're private independent operating foundations, typically where money came from a family or a person of wealth. And it's usually managed by a investment house or independent investors. So Mary Morton Parsons and Cabell are managed by Davenport. So we don't raise money. All of our money we give out comes from our assets under management. I hope most of you are familiar with the Community Foundation. They have 2 different ways they give out money. One, you can give money, people can give money to the Community Foundation directly, and they have certain criteria and areas of that they give money to, and then and typically they're defined, they define that and post that on their website. And then there's also something called donor advised funds, and that's where a person wants to set up a fund. It's almost like a private independent foundation within the Community Foundation. And they have a separate side of the foundation that manages that. Molly Bittner runs that. And so typically they look out for the funder. Some of them are scholarships. Some of them might be, other purposes. And so you may get a grant from the Community Foundation, but it'll come from the donor advised side. And so that means that the donor typically wants you to go directly through the Community Foundation to make, not make the ask, but make the thank you and all that kind of stuff. They don't want you to kind of figure out that the check came from the Thalheimer Foundation and you should go back to the Thalheimer Foundation and thank them directly. Any of the stuff that comes from the donor advised side should be stewarded and thanked through the donor advised side of the Community Foundation. There's also grant making foundations, and those are those company sponsored foundations that we talked about. And then there's also exempt operating foundations. So I don't know if anybody on the call is from universities, but typically a lot of universities will have different foundations. Like there is the business school has a foundation, the medical side has a foundation. And so typically what happens is they raise money for the programs within that side of the house. So like, for example, when Mary Morton Parsons funds Massey Cancer, the funds actually go to the medical side of VCU and they distribute it back to Massey Cancer. So exempt operating foundations, you typically can't make an ask of, but you'll see that explained when if you're, looking for money through a foundation or if you're getting money from a foundation. Any questions so far? Okay. So the last type of funding source that I want to talk about is government grants. I'm sure a lot of you get money from the Virginia Commission for the Arts. You get money from, you know, the NEA. Those are government grants. They have high expectations. They're usually pretty long to fill out. They're usually pretty large dollars. And you have to account for every expenditure, which you have to do for all grants. But with government grants, it's a pretty rigorous system to keep track of. You also have to spend all your funds or return them. And a lot of government grants are actually reimbursable grants, which means that they will give you a promise of a grant, and then they'll release certain amounts of money every quarter. And typically, any project changes have to be approved by their program officer. The good thing about government grants is that a lot of times they're reviewed by a committee, and you'll usually get a deep dive afterwards of, you know, why they didn't fund you or different suggestions. I wouldn't consider CultureWorks government grants, obviously, but am I right, Scott? But they similarly have a, you know, granting source, obviously, that you know of that you can go to with a grant cycle.
That's right. We're not considered government
Right.
grants, although our cultural equity grants are specific. They are NEA funded, so we do apply some government reporting requirements to that grant.
Gotcha. So really quickly, I just love this chart. Really quickly, you can see I've broken it down by corporations, foundations, and government. And so when I worked for Wachovia and now Wells Fargo, they typically have a group within each branch or within each area. So in Richmond, we had a group of bankers. It was usually representative of the business banking, the commercial banking, someone from the financial, someone from the operations center, and they get together every so often and would make decisions on the grants. Typically, I haven't seen an application in a while, but typically on bank grants or a lot of these corporate grants, they do ask if you have a volunteer relationship or some kind of relationship with the corporation. You also, especially in banking, you want to make sure that if you have a banker who we work directly with, you want to make sure he or she knows that you're applying for a grant from the bank, because typically they can help leverage or help, you know, lobby on your behalf. There's no guarantee just because you have people from a corporation on your board, you know, Capital One or Genworth or the banks or whatever, but you want to make sure that if you are applying for a grant, that they know so that they can let their community affairs people know. When I was at Wachovia, it was when Wachovia and Wachovia Securities were here. Both, I don't know how many of you probably don't remember that, but so we only had one foundation bucket that we gave out money in, but each of us had two separate sponsorship buckets. So a lot of times we'd go to events and there would be a Wachovia securities table, there'd be a Wachovia bank table, and then there'd also be usually a wealth management table. So we tried to kind of centralize that because there's no reason. That was all the same kind of money coming from Wachovia Corporation. But as far as our grants were concerned, when we went online for grants, we would ask specific questions about, you know, what kind of relationship you had. And I would also, you know, kind of look at who might have a banking relationship with them. And I once got a $100,000 grant from an organization. I'm not going to mention which one it was, but they had actually 3 board members, 2 from Wachovia Securities and 1 from Wachovia Bank on their board. And actually the board chair of the board was from Wachovia Securities. And this organization asked for a $100,000 grant, and the 3 board members knew nothing about it. And so obviously they didn't get funded the first time around because nobody lobbied for them. And $100,000 is a lot of money to ask a bank unless you have a nod from the bank that you should do that. Or a corporation, generally, they don't kind of give those kind of dollars. Foundations are the private foundations like Mary Morton Parsons, the Cabell, the family foundations. Their key decision makers are their trustees. If it's a family foundation, typically there's lots of family members. Robbins Foundation specifically does have some non-family members on it. Their grant amounts vary depending on their assets under management. Typically, they have to give out 5% of their rolling average assets every year. Their guidelines do vary, and they're usually the least risk adverse because they don't really base it on political. Corporations are probably the most risk adverse even though they're not supposed to, like when I was the community affairs manager, I didn't know if somebody was a client of the bank or not intentionally, but you do rely on your bankers kind of sending you emails and whispering in your ear that they're a large client, they're not a large client. And those are the decisions don't get made that way, but if 2 or 3 organizations apply at the same time for very similar missions, probably, I can't speak for all the banks now, but probably the one who has the organization who has a banking relationship or someone on their board who's a large banker, large stock person who has a relationship with the bank, they probably would get the grant over somebody who doesn't have that relationship. And the government grants are pretty risk adverse. They usually are done by a peer review committee. They're large grants. They come from taxpayer money. They're very lengthy. And a lot of times they like you to have collaborative relationships with other organizations. So any questions on that? Because that kind of sums up corporations, foundations, and government. So one of the things I want to talk about next is about telling your story, because I think as a grantor, that's the one thing that is most important to me is kind of the story that you tell. Your your reputation, your mission, your vision, your impact, how you're articulating it. Typically, as you know, most of the grants now are online, so you only have a short space to articulate your need. But you want to make sure that you have a good reputation out there, that your website is up to date, your social media helps articulate, because just because you put it online and the grantor may go to other sources to look at. Also, a lot of times when you tell your story, you want to make sure that let the good funder know that they've funded you before, that you have a long relationship with them if you can. You also want to make sure that you fit the guidelines of the organization. It's very important, like with Merriam Wharton Parsons, I get a lot of grants for program needs. Merriam Wharton Parsons clearly states in our guidelines that we don't do program needs. We only do capital needs. Capital needs have a, wide definition. It doesn't necessarily have to be bricks and mortar. It could be, equipment. It could be trucks. It could be, sometimes technology. We're trying to get away from that. But there's lots of, ways to define capital. So, but it does not get defined by organizational programming. So telling your story is very, very important. What happened here? You want to make sure that, you know your target audience. Again, have you gotten funding in the past? And how do you define your project or your problem? What happened here? So again, with banking, with grants, relationships are very, very important. You want to always make sure that you can, if you see a funder in person, you want to make sure that, you introduce yourself. Don't spend a lot of time occupying their time, but kind of make sure they know who you are. If some of the grantors have online times when they talk about, their grant giving guidelines or different things, and that you'll see them at lunches. So make sure, that you have a good relationship with the funder, but you also don't have an inappropriate relationship. Like a lot of times, since I've been doing this for about 15 years or more, plus whatever I did at Wachovia, so it's probably about 20 years totally. I have people who actually will, kind of try and take advantage of that relationship. So they will, like, we used to, when we used to do grants, not online, people would call me the week before the grant was due or the day before the grant was due. And they'd say, hey, Amy, this is so-and-so, want to let you know I'm going to be a little late with my grant, but I'll get it in. Or, hey, Amy, we know each other really well. Hope you'll, take that into account when you look at our funding. Not appropriate. You also, when you do talk to a funder, a lot of times funders will actually tell you, some of the hints of, you should ask for this amount, or maybe this isn't the right time to come. You should come at a different cycle. And so listen to that kind of stuff. You also want to make sure that if some of your board members have a relationship with the funder, you take advantage of those, but be careful about that, because if you have a long-term relationship with the funder, you probably don't need your board member to call them or email them and let them know that you're applying again. If you, typically my rule of thumb is, let's say you've been getting $5,000 or $10,000 from a funder for a long time, and you want to go up take the ask up, then you might want to have your board member, make a call or email, or make sure you have a nod from the funder that it's okay to go from 5,000 to 15,000. But again, those board relationships are very, very important. The other thing I will say is that one of the things that a lot of people do is when they do their board meetings, they actually pass around or talk about a list of grants they're applying for, and then they ask their board members who they might know or what kind of introductions they can help make. So those kind of things are really, really helpful. So typically, again, talking to the funder, I usually talk about the 3 C's: contact your funder, be consistent about who you're approaching for funding. And, that doesn't mean that you automatically assume that because the funder gives you, $5,000, you're going to do the same every year. Make sure you understand their guidelines and, what they're doing. And if they have a wait out period, some funders have a 3-year wait out period, some have a 5-year, some have a 1-year. Some don't have a wait out period. Also make sure that you do look at their guidelines and look at their conformity, especially towards DEI. Most funders now are asking some DEI questions. Some are using them to kind of sway their funding decisions. Some are not. I'll speak for Mary Morton Parsons. On our grant application, we do ask a lot of DEI questions, but we're not at the point where we are making decisions based on that. We're keeping those statistics to kind of get a lay of the land, and then trying to decide as we keep going forward where that plays a role in the grant making. Again, let's see, sorry. Can't see the top, so that's what's driving me crazy here. So, sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here. So again, make sure that, before you contact a funder, you've done your research. You're not just going down the list and asking some questions that don't really make sense. You want to use your time with the funder wisely. Again, make sure that, the funder understands you've done your research. You also want to make sure, sometimes a common question is, is your IRS Form 990 indicative of your giving priorities, or have there been changes? So again, when I used to do research, it was very important to use the different resource sites, like the used to be called the Foundation Center, and now it's all through Candid. They do give a lot of information on there, but remember that they're only as good as the information the funder's given them. Most of their information comes up from the 990. So like, I know that for me, Mary Morton Parsons gets a note probably every March or April asking us to update our funding stuff on the website. Sometimes I've been able to do that, and sometimes I've forgotten. So make sure that if the funder has a website, you go to that, because that's usually the most up-to-date, sometimes more up-to-date than what you find on, excuse me, on some of those sites. Again, before, when you're, you want to make sure again that you're know all the guidelines. It's very, very important to know your guidelines and do your research and your deadlines. If a funder says, 5 o'clock, it's due on a certain day, you need to do that. Don't assume, some will have postmarks, some will have, most of them are online now, so you typically don't have that problem. But like with Mary Morton Parsons, we have a 5 o'clock deadline on September 15th and March 15th. And if it comes in after that, we don't take it. We also have a deadline for talking to the funder first. So Mary Morton Parsons has a contact form, and I think Cabell does the same thing, where you have a contact form that you have to fill out on the website, and it has to be filled out 2 weeks before the deadline. So the September deadline, usually have to fill them out by like August 29th, August 28th, March deadline, like February 28th, February 27th. This cycle, we did get a number of grants contact forms past the deadline, and I had to email the people and say, no, we couldn't do that, come back at a different time. So when you're doing your proposal, a couple other things is that make sure your proposal is easy to read. You want to make sure that, you've used language that's appropriate for the sector you're in. So if there's typically certain terms that funders use to talk about, funders are looking for like educational art programs or different programs. Make sure that, the funder knows that you are familiar with those terms, kind of those politically correct terms, I call them, making sure that it's not usually a one-time program. Make sure some of the funders will ask where you're also looking for additional funding. I know that with banks specifically, they want to make sure that, if you're asking them for a sponsorship or a large amount, they want to make sure that they kind of own the real estate, or, they look at who they're competing with. So, excuse me, a lot of times, like if it's the Capital One duck race, then possibly Bank of America or Wells Fargo won't be one of your sponsors for that, because Capital One already has a large market share. Again, those deadlines, I can't say enough about those. Only include the requested attachments. When Mary Morton Parsons used to take handwritten or hand-done applications or by mail, I used to get notebooks, fancy notebooks, and lots of pictures and different things. And purpose of going online is to kind of avoid some of those things, so you level the playing field. If a funder reads your grant and they need more information, I promise you they'll call you when they're doing their due diligence. And again, just like you do with individual funders, remember that fundraising is cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship. So you want to make sure that you don't forget that when you're doing, corporation and foundation funders. Like with Mary Morton Parsons, we only give once every 5 years. So I can go back to my hard copy or my online files and look at when the last time I heard from that person. And typically I usually see the most activity a couple months before they're going to apply for the next grant. So, just be careful about that and make sure that, you've said thank you notes and you've done appropriate thank yous. Don't feel like you have to take the funder to lunch or dinner or send flowers or fruit baskets, because that's really not appropriate. And, a simple thank you note is great. Or sometimes if some of your board members want you to do a thankathon or something, it's always good to hear from some of the board members to thank them. Thank you for your grant. I'm going to stop for a minute. Are there any questions, Catherine or Scott or anybody?
No, I don't see any questions in the chat. No.
Okay. So again, a lot of this is repetitive just because I think you have to hear it a few times. But again, make sure that you've clearly stated your goals and objectives. You show a record of success. So there are other sources of funding that you've done. The other thing that some people might not realize is, let's say you're starting a new program and you're asking for funding for that. You want to make sure that two things. One is that you have in your grant proposal somewhere, you've talked about the fact that you have a history of, starting up new funding and it's starting up new programming and it's been very successful. Or a lot of times, let's say an arts organization in North Carolina is doing a program and you want to do a similar program, you can refer to that program in North Carolina as to give you some credibility that you're looking at that for ideas and kind of impact that they made and how you can do some of that in your program. Also, again, this realistic amount to be funded is very important. Again, you want to make sure you know what the assets under management is, if it's a private foundation, so that you can, and what their history of giving to certain organizations is. With a corporation, it's harder to tell that, but you can do it by past history of looking, what foundations have given, because a foundation is going to know that you haven't done your research, or you haven't, like you just kind of thought about it at the last second if you ask for an amount that's kind of inappropriate. When I was at Wachovia, I was there when they went from the hard copy grants to going online. And the first time that grants came online, I never forget that, there was about 4 or 5 grants that were $50,000 or above. And I would say, to the bankers, do you know these organizations? Did you let them know that they could apply for that amount? They didn't call me and asked if they could apply for that amount. That's a lot of money, especially for a bank. So, be careful about what you're applying for. And, don't just assume that, oh, the funder is going to give me half of what I apply for, so I need to, up my ante and then I'll hopefully get half of that. Listen to the funder when they talk to you. look at what else they funded, because very, very important. The other thing is that you also don't get extra points if you pad your results or pad what you're looking for. If you realistically, it's going to take you, a year and a half to do something, and this is the funding to start it, say that. Or, and the other thing, I think I've said this to people before, is let's say you turn in your grant and you say that, you're going to help 100 people do blah, 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 blah. And then 6 months into the grant, you realize that, no, you're not going to make 100 people. You're going to really only do 50 people because the economy or something's changed or whatever. So make sure that you contact the funder at that point and you let them know that there's going to be a change in what you thought you were going to be able to accomplish. I can bet you about 90% of the time, the funder is not going to take away your funding. They want to know that you've adjusted and they can adjust the message, because remember that most of the people in my position, we're not the final decision makers. We're your best advocate to the board who makes the decisions, or to the group of people who make the decisions. So make sure that you've let us know so we can let them know and manage expectations. For most foundations, it's harder to take the money back than to readjust how the organization is going to use it. That also goes to, I get a lot of calls from people, and they'll say, well, you gave us, $100,000 and we still have $10,000 left after we've done everything. Would you want us to send that $10,000 back? And I usually say, no, tell me how you want to use that, put it in writing, and we can approve that. So most funders are willing to work with you. So please make sure that you take the time to ask that and take the time to get a relationship with the funder. Again, reporting is very important. Some funders do require a very formal report, some do not. I always recommend that if the funder does not require a formal report, when you send your thank you or send it at the end of the project, send them a note saying, here's what you accomplished. Here might be some pictures, come and visit. Because, most people are not keeping hard files now. They're keeping files on the computer, but I can tell you that those computer files are going to have notice of when the last time they heard from you, or, did you send us any statistics on the grant? You don't want to get a phone call from the funder and say, well, I can't look at your new grant because we never heard how you ended up with the last grant. If they do have a formal report, make sure you fill that out. Be accountable with deadlines. There are some funders who will ask for deadlines at different points in the grant, so make sure you do that. And again, don't give them any surprises. Be accountable, meet deadlines, and be upfront and transparent about how you're using the money and what kind of impact you're making. This stewardship is also really important, is to make sure that, you're not just contacting the funder when you need the money. You're kind of sending them notes or sending them emails or putting them on your mailing list, or making sure, that a lot of times I'll get phone calls from people and they'll say, I'm in Richmond for a conference. Do you have time for me to stop by and give you some information, or can you, get on a phone call for 5 minutes and talk to me? And so those are good because they're good stewardship times. Also don't forget to invite the funder for a visit, or if you invite them to a special event, make sure that you understand that if it's a private foundation, they can't pay for the tickets, or you can't ask them to fill a table. But if, let's say, you have some spots at somebody's table that you're not filling, that's a great place to invite some of the somebody who's a funder to come and be at your event. With corporations, obviously, you typically will have tables that they'll have to fill. So again, I love this quote. It's been said that a grant writing is like playing the stock market. There's seldom a guarantee that your efforts will be rewarded, but the more you know about the process and the more you use this knowledge, the greater the probability for success. So again, don't just, assume that you know everything about the organization. Things could have changed. The people who make the decisions could have changed. It's real important to be respectful of what's going on out there and the landscape of what's happening. So I think this is one of the last slides. I belong to some funders groups, and we talk about different things, not about organizations specifically, but about different things that we don't appreciate from grantees, so that we can kind of communicate out what is good. And there's also, I sort of put together this cute slide about top 10 reasons to lose your funding if you don't do these things. So again, one of them would be obviously never communicate with your funder. If you're having problems, deny them or hide them. Don't play well with others. So if you're not collaborating with others in your field, that could be a problem. Also, when you write your grant, don't put down we're the only organization doing blah, 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 if you're not really the only organization. And if you are, like, an organization who's collaborating with other organizations, make sure you mention that, because that gives you kind of extra credibility. If you don't, if you turn in all your reports late, no one's going to read them. That's probably a good way to lose your funding or not get your funding. When reapplying for funding, don't spend a lot of time on your application. That says it all it needs to say. Again, if you want to lose your funding, be sure to change your grant goals and objectives midstream without checking with your funder. Again, if the grant pays for personnel, allow positions to remain vacant for months. Speaking of budgets, don't check your math in your with your budget, or kind of show if you show that you're going to be in a deficit, make sure you put some notes in there as to how you're getting out of that, or what you're doing to reach into your reserves, that kind of stuff. Also, if you want to lose your funding, pad your budget so grant reviewers will have a safe place to fall. And when writing a request for grants, try to make your grant reviewer laugh. So kind of a stupid slide, but it kind of sums up a lot of the stuff that I've said. So I'm happy to take questions now. It's we have about 15 minutes for me to take questions. I'm gonna stop sharing the slide and open it up for questions.
We have one question that says, are funders more likely to award a smaller amount than asked, or deny it entirely if it's an inappropriate amount?
I think it depends on the funder. Like I said, again, funders typically don't look at it and say, oh, they asked me $100,000, I'm going to give them 50. Most funders, will manage their expectations. Like, I know I'm one of those funders that I'm happy to talk to someone and say, in the past, we've given you, $50,000. I understand your program's a little more, maybe ask for 100, or don't ask for any more. Most funders will hopefully manage your expectations. If they don't, you're just going to have to use your best judgment on what to do. But like, I can tell you some crazy stories. The one that sticks in my mind the most is that, hey, right before COVID, I met with a grantee and their head of their capital campaign, and we met at Cafe Couture, I remember specifically, and we talked about their capital project, and I managed their expectations, and I said, I think you should ask for $300,000. It's pretty consistent with what we've been giving you in the past and what your needs are, blah, 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 blah. Left the meeting. The next day, I get a phone call from the development person in the organization, and she says, Amy, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you if we could really ask for $1 million. And I'm like, what? And she said, well, you gave $1 million to this organization, and they're very similar to us, which they weren't. And I said, we'd really like to ask for $1 million. And I'm like, I said to her, I said, you know what? You're really out of line. And if you ask for $1 million, you probably will get nothing at this point. So I don't think I'd go there. And I mean, I just think it took a lot of chutzpah for her to do that, because she didn't know the history. The other organization, they happened to have one of our board members on the board. They hadn't done a capital campaign in like a long time. It wasn't like they had a capital campaign and they were coming to Mary Morton Parsons every 5 years for a grant. It was 10 or 15 years before they had done a previous capital campaign. So that's a no-no, a big no-no. And so there's lots of, I mean, I can tell you on the opposite side, lots of good stories about people who, do great stewardship. And, I funded an organization. Mary Morton Parsons funded an organization when I first got there. And the organization came to me after I got there, and they said that, they had miscalculated the campaign, and that before they could do some of the work on the campaign, they had to do some infrastructure on the grounds of the organization, and that they wanted to know if Mary Morton Parsons would be willing to redirect our grant to that need instead of what we had directed our grant towards. And I mean, it was great stewardship. I was very happy to go to the board and ask that question, versus them taking the liberty of doing it without, asking any questions. So there's tons of stories on both sides. But again, rule of thumb is to, have great relationships or try to have good long-term relationship with the funder, and be transparent and upfront with the funder.
Your next question is to reestablish relationships when prior leadership committed some of the ways to lose funding. Is it appropriate to reach out for meetings with grant organizations to discuss possible future relationships?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Typically, Mary Morton Parsons funds the organization, not the person. And so, so we want to protect the organization. And so just because you had a development person or something that made a misstep, you don't know why they made that misstep. I'm guessing they probably didn't do it on purpose. So I'm not going to hold that against the organization. So again, it's always good to establish relationships. And one of the rules of thumb with that is when grantors have specific deadlines, try and establish relationships early on, or if you're asking for a grant, don't wait until like 2 weeks before the grant deadline to talk to the funder, because, the sooner and the earlier you can talk to them, the better. There's no reason, like if somebody comes to me and they want to talk and it's 6 months before the grant is, the cycle is due, I may say to them, thank you for contacting me. Can we get a date closer to the deadline? But at least I know that they were thoughtful enough to think about that versus, 2 days before, or 2 days before the contact form is due. They, have called me and said, I want to do X, Y, and Z, and they haven't really thought through it. So again, yes, I don't think funders are going to blame the organization if a person makes a misstep, because usually they aren't on purpose anyway.
And your next question is, do you have any advice for organizations that are applying for grants with fiscal sponsorship prior to acquiring a 501c3?
Sure. So I think that in those cases, you want to make sure that you've got some credibility of other people who are funding you, whether it's individuals or corporations or groups that you're working with. Startups are great. You just want to make sure, depending on the funder, sometimes they don't want to be, the first in. And they want to know that there's other people who have bought in and that that gives you credibility. You know what I'm saying? That's part of the reason that Mary Morton Parsons does challenge grants, because, when we give you the grant, we could give you the money right away. And in some cases, we do smaller grants where we don't make you match. But when we give you the challenge grant, it gives you credibility. And, if you go to a funder and you say, well, Mary Morton Parsons is giving us a grant, but we have to raise X amount to get the grant, they're going to take notice, kind of like that, Virginia Public Media, when they have their campaign to raise money and they say, all the dentist office, Dr. Baxter is going to give, $10,000, additional $10,000 if, 5 dentist office give X amount, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I don't think you should be afraid, if you're a startup or a supporting organization, call the funder, ask that. The other thing I'll say along those lines is a lot of times, people will call me and they'll say, we don't have a formal audit. We're too small to have a formal audit. Is it okay to apply? And typically in those cases, as long as you have, a financial letter or some kind of, credibility showing that, your finances are in order, whatever, or a letter from an outside, person, they'll fund you on that. Some will not, but I know, like, there are a number of people that will do that because we understand that startups are important. Other questions?
I do not have any more questions in the chat.
Anybody want to raise their hand, turn on their camera, whatever? Hey, Annie.
Hello. Sorry, my camera's in a weird spot, so it's hard for me to.
Okay, I'm sorry I haven't been very active on the committee, but I'm not even going to be able to be at the luncheon, unfortunately.
Oh, that's fine. No worries. But this is great. Thank you so much for all this.
Sure. And if anybody has any other things afterwards, like I said, I'm one of those funders that I like to think I'm pretty friendly and happy to meet with people. So, or take a phone call or whatever. I feel like that's my job, is to be out there and not be a gatekeeper. And I will say in response to my other colleagues who do funding, sometimes people have so much on their plate that they have to wait till you turn in the application before they can do the due diligence. Some of us like to do it the other way. So, you know, just because a funder won't talk to you doesn't mean that they're not interested in what you're funding or whatever. You know, just depends on how that funder likes to do their business. You know, for me, I like to do a lot of my due diligence upfront before people apply, and then use the time between application and board meeting to kind of follow up and, you know, that kind of stuff. But, and the other tip I'll tell you is that just because a funder doesn't make a site visit does not mean that you won't get funded. You know, some funders don't have time to do site visits, or, you know, they may not do a formal site visit, that kind of stuff. Or maybe they funded you for a long time and don't feel like they need to do a new site visit. So don't be put off that somebody won't do, you know, because they're not doing a site visit, you're not getting funded. You know, but listen to that funder when they talk to you, because if they tell you that, you know, 2 other organizations similar to you are applying this time and it might not be the best time for you to apply, then you want to do that, because, you know, like some organizations also have a sit out period. Like, so for Mary Morton Parsons, if you apply for a grant and you don't get funded for that cycle, you have to wait a whole year before you can get funded again. So you want to know all the intricacies to make sure that, you know, you don't waste a time to apply or whatever if it's not appropriate.
Amy, new question for you. A lot of folks on this call may be maybe newer at reaching out to foundations and such, and obviously this relationship is the relationship piece can be critical. What advice do you have for folks that don't have relationships with these different foundations yet, but want to start a relationship with them?
So I guess a couple of things. One is, you know, a lot of funders go to lunches, you know, at different, you know, events, right? So when you see a funder at an event, you know, introduce yourself. You know, don't spend 20 minutes telling him your story about your organization at that time, but just, you know, hey, I'm, you know, Scott from CultureWorks, would love to talk to you, you know, or I'm a big leave a message person. When I used to do development at the Visual Arts Center, which was the Hand Workshop Art Center, when I worked there, I was really big about leaving messages after 5 o'clock. And when I know that the person wouldn't be there, but leaving a really detailed message. And then that way, when you call them back, you know, or maybe they'll call you back, they know what you're calling for. So be really good at leaving messages. Also, emails are a great way to make introduction. You know, like if Scott knows someone and they're willing to introduce you, you know, use that as a resource too. I mean, there are lots of ways to do it. I guess I would say that, you know, it's not working with grantors is not for the faint at heart. So don't be shy, is I guess what I'll say. I mean, don't be obnoxious, but don't be shy. There's kind of a fine line between that. And most funders, you know, are really happy to talk to people and really happy to know what you're doing. And there's several funding groups that meet on a regular basis, so that we can get the pulse on what's happening in the community and be less reactive and more proactive funders. And so I think that plays into, you know, if there's an event you think is going to be a lot of funders there, make sure you try and be there to, you know, have your presence there. So does that answer your question, Scott?
It absolutely does. And one other idea that comes to mind for me, and curious to get your thoughts on it, Amy. When I was first getting started at CultureWorks, I would talk to some of the people that we already had as funders and say, "Hey, I don't know anyone at this foundation.
Yep.
Would you be willing?" And if those funders are already have a good relationship, you know, with our organization, then they may be willing to make introductions to others.
Yes.
Do you believe most funders fall into that category and willing to
Yes.
make those kind of introductions?
Absolutely. When I worked at Wachovia, Victor Branch was at Bank of America in the same position as me. And so we were literally across the street offices from each other. And I can't tell you how many times I would get a phone call from someone that said, "Oh, I just talked to Victor and he said I should call you," or I would do the same thing. And, you know, so that's why you want to have a good relationship. You know, like I always say when I teach the grant classes, if you don't get funded by a funder, don't call them and say, "I can't believe you didn't fund me, blah, blah, blah." You know, call them and say, "Hey, thank you for, you know, considering. Is there any feedback?" Because you never know when at the end of the year that funder might have some extra money and they may remember that, you know, they couldn't fund you for X reason, but now some extra money's come available and they can give it to you, or they can make an introduction, or maybe next cycle they're trying to fund something and they remember that you fit into that category. So they'll call you and say, "Hey, you know, I couldn't fund you last time. Are you still doing blah, 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 blah. Can we talk?" you know, because again, most funders now are trying to be what they call proactive instead of reactive. And reactive means that, you know, you're only reacting to, you know, emergency situations or dire situations, but proactive means that, you know, when issues come up in the community, we're there to help, you know, affordable housing, you know, the different issues with the schools, that kind of stuff. You know, funders are trying to be there to help, you know.
That's great. I see we're at time. Any other burning questions from the group?
I think my email is at the end of this and my phone number. So feel free to, you know, give me a call. I'm happy to help in any way. The next cycle for Marymount Parsons is September 15th. So I'm kind of trying to lay low and do stuff for that. So if you want to talk to me, we can get on the calendar for after May, because my cycle will be done in May, and then I can start up again. So, but I'm happy to put you on the calendar or whatever. And
Thanks
thank
so
you
much,
guys.
Amy.
Yeah, and please, thank you guys for all you're doing for the community. There's so many great organizations out there, and you know, I recognize a lot of the names on this call, and so thank you for all you're doing, because I know the landscape is hard, and you guys don't have easy jobs. So stick with it, and you know, keep doing good stuff.
Thanks so much, Amy. This has been terrific.
No problem.
And I will also plug CultureWorks grant cycle comes to a close March 28th. If you're considering applying, be sure to get those applications in. And Catherine, anything you want to add to close out?
No, we will get this recording uploaded to our YouTube channel, and then it will live on the website in case you need to go back and rewatch it. And I hope the handouts are helpful to you all.
Yeah, and if there's something else you need, just let me know. I'm one of those geeks who have a lot of nonprofit information, either on the computer or hard copy. So I'm happy to share.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.